If you've ever wondered why ancient kings were sometimes sacrificed, why mistletoe was considered magical, or why certain taboos appear across distant cultures that never interacted, or if you enjoy sprawling explorations of mythology, ritual, and belief that tries to get at the root of it all, if so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing The Golden Bough, a study of magic and religion by Sir James George Frazer. Welcome to Spencer's Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and I picked up today's book, The Golden Bough, because I was diving into the origins of religion, trying to better understand how early societies explained the world around them and how those explanations shaped everything from politics to ritual to storytelling. Over the years, I've heard this book mentioned by teachers and professors and just authors as a foundational, if somewhat controversial work in the study of myth and religion, so I figured it was time to finally tackle it for myself. I will say, this isn't a casual read. It is dense, it is sprawling, and it is packed with references to ancient customs from every corner of the globe, but it is also incredibly ambitious. The author set out to uncover the deep patterns beneath human belief systems, and whether or not you agree with all of his conclusions, it's hard not to be impressed by the scale of what he was trying to do. If any of this sounds interesting to you, please, I recommend that you go check out my other channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan. That is one of the reasons why I picked up this book, as I was looking into the origins of religion and myth. A little bit about the author, actually a fair amount about the author. I think to give this book its due, I should put a fair amount of information about the context and why it is a significant book. So, Sir James George Frazer lived from 1854 to 1941. He was a Scottish anthropologist, a classicist, and one of the towering figures in the early development of mythography and comparative religion. He was born in Glasgow on New Year's Day in 1854, and he was born the son of a chemist, and he displayed a lifelong love for learning. So after attending Springfield and Larkfield Academies, he studied at the University of Glasgow and then Trinity College, Cambridge, where he graduated with honors in classics. Though he trained as a lawyer at the Middle Temple, he never practiced. Instead, he devoted his life to scholarly work. He remained at Trinity for nearly his entire academic career, holding a fellowship there and only briefly departing for a year-long stint at the University of Liverpool. He was knighted in 1914 and honored with lectureships at Cambridge, Oxford, Glasgow, and Liverpool. Though he suffered from severe visual impairments later in life, he continued his scholarship until the very end. He and his wife Lily, who played a crucial role in managing his public presence and adapting his work for wider audiences, died within hours of each other in 1941 and are buried together in Cambridge. Although Frazer is most widely known for this book, The Golden Bough, his output was staggering, including multi-volume commentaries on classical texts, works on totemism, religion, myth, taboo, and comparative folklore, all of which are also part of this book. His method relied heavily on secondhand accounts drawn from ancient histories, as well as missionary questionnaires and imperial correspondence. I will say more about his sources. This is one of the big questions about his work. He did not conduct fieldwork himself, but instead constructed his sweeping theories of cultural evolution from his vast reading and correspondence. His work was deeply influenced by E.B. Tyler and his friend, the biblical scholar William Robertson Smith. Frazer was the first major scholar to articulate a relationship between myth and ritual and proposed that human societies developed through three general stages of magic, religion, and then finally science. In this model, he controversially presented religion as a kind of transitional superstition, a mistaken yet perhaps necessary step towards modern scientific understanding. And this view was part of a broader secularization narrative that made The Golden Bough both immensely influential and deeply contentious. So while the author's vision of sacrificial kings and sacred groves and fertility rites shaped how generations of artists and scholars thought about mythology, stuff like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, his legacy has become a little more complex. Later scholars have criticized his assumptions, noting the imperialistic or the Eurocentric and occasionally pretty racist overtones in his work. He often imposed Christian theological language onto non-Christian belief systems, and sometimes deliberately, as in the case of his refusal to use native terminology when describing Aboriginal Australian rituals. So his tendency to draw broad conclusions from loosely connected or cherry-picked examples has also been the subject of academic pushback. Yet, despite these criticisms, he remains a foundational figure. His ability to synthesize mythic and ritual patterns across time and space gave rise to an entire field of scholarship. And for all of the flaws in his work, his sheer ambition and scope remain admirable, especially considering that he was writing for an era before modern anthropology had settled on a unified methodology. Of course, the author's own relationship with belief was complicated. While he is often described as an atheist, particularly given his harsh critiques of Christianity, he also maintained a lifelong fascination with Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. There's a sense, even in his most skeptical writings, that he was captivated by the idea that myth and ritual hold some deep, even elusive truth beyond the human condition. So this is my overview of the book itself. It is huge, so this will be a lengthy overview, but I want to give you an idea of exactly how he tackles this subject. The Golden Bough also is not a single book. It is what some might consider an intellectual odyssey, and it is one of the most ambitious comparative studies of religion, as well as magic, myth, and ritual ever undertaken. Originally, it was published in 2 volumes in 1890, and eventually it expanded to 12 massive volumes by 1915, plus a 13th volume in 1936. The work was later condensed into a 1-volume abridgment in 1922, prepared with significant help from his wife Lily. This abridged version became the most widely read and circulated version, though much of the original's exhaustive detail, especially its more controversial comparisons to Christianity, were trimmed from it. And this is actually the version that I read. And for comparison, it was still 1,665 pages. So just colossal. At its heart, the Golden Bough seeks to answer a deceptively simple question. At the heart of it is a deceptively simple question. He asks this from the very beginning, and it's something that you're going to come back to again and again. He asks, why was a priest king annually sacrificed in the sacred grove of Diana at Nemi, which was a lakeside town near Rome? And from that very grisly puzzle, Frazer launches an expansive investigation into mythological and ritualistic parallels across cultures, tracing patterns of kingship, fertility rites, scapegoating, and seasonal death and rebirth ceremonies across the globe. He moves from the ancient Mediterranean to Africa, to Asia, to Polynesia, and the Americas, drawing on a staggering range of examples from tribal rituals to ancient literature to folk customs. The author's central thesis is that human belief evolves in 3 main stages: magic, then religion, and finally science. Early humans, he argued, believed they could control nature through sympathetic magic, or practices based on analogical thinking. For example, like produces like, or contact transfers essence. As these magical systems failed, they were replaced by religion, which invoked spiritual beings rather than impersonal forces. Eventually, science would supplant both, grounded in empirical verification and reason. And so the author sees in ancient rituals a kind of logic, however misguided, and attempts to show that religious myths and ceremonies, even when wildly different in surface form, are undergirded by shared archetypes: the dying and reviving god, the sacred marriage, the scapegoat, and the taboo. He uses this framework to explore a dizzying array of topics like sacred kingship, totemism, taboos on menstruation and birth, the magical properties of mistletoe, and the ritual expulsion of evil during festivals. What's most remarkable is the ambition. The Golden Bough is a comprehensive catalog of human belief, more so than, say, a tidy argument. And it aims to demonstrate that behind every myth and ritual, there lies a rational human effort to engage with the natural world, ensure fertility, explain death, and to maintain social order. For the author, the similarities across time and culture are not coincidental, but reflective of a universal human psychology. Despite its sprawling nature, the book maintains a surprisingly clear narrative arc, returning again and again to its key ideas: the sacrificial king, the cyclical nature of fertility and death, and the progression from superstition to civilization. Even in its abridged form, it's not a quick or easy read, but it is a deeply absorbing one for readers interested in mythology, religion, anthropology, or the intellectual history of how we came to understand belief itself. With that in mind, let me give you a section by section description. Now, the abridged version that I read was, I want to say 69 chapters. I'm not going to give you a chapter by chapter below, but I will certainly try to give you some broad themes and split them up into sections. So the first section, sacred kingship and the origins of the book. This talks about the king of the world and priestly kings. He introduces the central question that we've been talking about this whole time: why must the priest king at Nemi be ritually killed by his successor? I know that sounds like such a strange thing to be the premise of what has become a sprawling book, but that was the question that got it all started. And you can see how it gets spun out into so much more than that. And so he uses this mystery to launch this sweeping investigation into all the ancient religions and myth. And he proposes that many early societies viewed kings as divine or semi-divine beings whose deaths were necessary to ensure the fertility of nature and the survival of the community. And he details quite a few of them. Section 2 we'll call magic, religion, and power. In this one, we have the discussion of stuff like sympathetic magic and religion and magic, and of course, magicians as kings. In this section, he explores the evolution of human belief from magic to religion. I already mentioned he categorizes magic into principles of like produces like and contact produces effect. And this section argues that many early rulers gained power through claims of magical control, particularly over weather and agriculture. In this section, we also see a discussion of incarnate human gods and departmental kings of nature. And it extends this idea, showing how people believed rulers embodied the divine or controlled specific aspects of nature. Section 3, vegetation myths and fertility rites. And this is a significant portion of the book. This is one of the longest and richest sections with chapters on tree worship, sacred marriage, the worship of the oak, and many, many more. And the author compares fertility rituals across the globe, linking them to the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest. He argues that vegetation gods like Dionysus and Demeter symbolize the life, death, and rebirth of crops, and that human rulers were often sacrificed to mirror these cycles. Section 4, taboo and the burden of divinity, the author shifts focus to tabooed acts, as well as tabooed persons and things and words. And he explores how early societies placed severe restrictions on kings, priests, and sacred individuals. These rules were meant to protect the divine figure and the people from spiritual danger, but they also reflect anxiety about proximity to the sacred. And so the author uses this to highlight both the power and the peril of religious leadership in tribal cultures. In section 5, we'll call this ritual death and substitution. This intense segment digs into practices of ritual regicide, temporary kingship, and the sacrifice of royal offspring. These chapters form the emotional and thematic heart of Frazer's theory that early religion centered on the death and renewal of sacred kings. Section 6, dying and rising gods. This one presents detailed case studies of Adonis, Attis, and Osiris, comparing their myths and rituals to the author's broader pattern. These gods die and return each year, mirroring the seasonal cycle. He links these Near Eastern and Mediterranean myths to earlier vegetation rites and argues they later influenced Greco-Roman and even Christian traditions. In section 7, grain spirits and animal sacrifice, the author explores Corn Mother, Corn Maiden, and corn spirits as animals, suggesting that agricultural communities often imagine grain as a deity that must be ritually killed during harvest. And he extends this into practices of animal sacrifice, showing how gods were symbolically or literally consumed by eating the god in ritual meals meant to bring fertility as well as protection and renewal. Section 8, scapegoats and social cleansing. In these chapters, the author discusses how societies ritually removed evil through scapegoat ceremonies. Sometimes animals and often humans were symbolically burdened with the community's sins and expelled or killed to purify the group. Section 9, festivals, fire, and folklore. This is a wide-ranging section that looks at seasonal festivals, fire rituals, and myths like Balder and the mistletoe, again tying them into themes of renewal, sacrifice, and divine vulnerability. And the author argues these traditions are survivals of prehistoric rituals, and they reflect a widespread concern with ensuring prosperity through symbolic death. Speaking of symbolic death, section 10 takes a look at the souls, the symbols, and the Golden Bough itself. These are, of course, the final chapters. They cover the last 5 or 6 chapters of the book, and they revisit the myth of the external soul, and the author finally circles back to the story of the Golden Bough, the whole reason we started this, and it is a branch that grants access to the underworld and symbolizes sacrificial succession at Nemi. The author closes with farewell to Nemi, and he reflects on what this long anthropological journey reveals about human belief, as well as fear and continuity. That is the main strokes of the book. It is sprawling. It touches upon so many different cultures, society, times, and places, and it is just a lot. And that's one of the reasons why it was so famous, regardless of actual arguments that he was making. Just the amount of diverse cultures that was represented in there, whether they were accurately represented or not, is a whole nother question. That raises the question of if most of this is, I don't want to necessarily say debunked, but it just, I've never heard anyone use it as a reference source, and at least in terms of like individual cultures that are mentioned here. I've only heard it as a reference source in terms of its larger influence on the development of certain fields, which raises the question, what is the historical significance of this? I think the subtitle actually says much more than the title. The Golden Bough can be very mysterious, which I think is actually part of the reason. The fact that it's called A Study in Magic and Religion goes much farther. And I think it stands as one of the most ambitious and influential works in the history of comparative religion and anthropology, which, by the way, at this point is a large field. There's much to it. This, as I said, was first published in 1890. And again, it started only as a 2-volume set, and it was so popular, and he just had so much to say that it slowly got expanded into a 12-volume epic, and it was eventually even 13. But really, the most valuable version of it was the one that got edited down, and even though it's still huge, it was a single volume that could be sold as such. And so throughout this, we see him tracing these common threads in myth and ritual and religious practice across so many cultures and times. And in so doing, he shapes not just scholarly discourse, but the cultural imagination of the 20th century. In other words, in the late 19th and early 20th century, as so much is changing and there's so much upheaval and there's still so much discussion about an enlightened world or a post-enlightened world, you are seeing Frazer really help define and help shape what people think of broader cultures, and giving this really powerful sense of where this eventual enlightenment is taking you, the way it is influencing the Western culture that is consuming what he is writing. At its core, what he is proposing is controversial, but it is also very captivating, and it's arguing for a certain progression of human thought, again, from magic to religion to science. And again, he argued that ancient societies believed they could control nature directly through magical rites, and when those failed, he turned to religion, and then supplicating divine powers instead. Only later, he claimed, did humanity arrive at rational scientific explanations. And so this evolutionary model may kind of feel reductive today, but at that time, for this specific thing, it was groundbreaking for its time and profoundly shaped early anthropological thought. I don't think I mentioned, I keep saying the Golden Bough and I talk about the sacrificial king, but maybe I should give a little more context of where that's coming from. One, so it makes a little more sense if you read this book or are just curious about the premise of it, and also why it was so interesting to so many people. And that's because it is actually going to engage in significant detail with a classic of Western canon. It's just going to take a very specific element of it. So the book's symbolic center is the whole Golden Bough. It's drawn from Virgil's Aeneid, the famous myth about the founding of Rome. Actually, there's a lot going on in the Aeneid, but specifically in there you have the myth of the Golden Bough, which is a sacred branch that grants Aeneas access to the underworld. And so the author uses this moment to introduce his real world counterpart, again, that cycle that he keeps talking about. And so he introduces it here, and he says that you have the Rex Nemorensis, or a priest king of Diana at Lake Nemi in Italy, who had to kill his predecessor in ritual combat. And this haunting image becomes the through line for the sprawling inquiry into the dying and rising gods, the sacred kingship, the seasonal festivals, the vegetation deities, and of course the stuff like scapegoating rituals. So across cultures from Europe to America and from Africa to Asia, you're seeing a through line that is all based within that myth from the Aeneid, which is something that helps tie everything together. Despite scholarly critique, it is worth noting that it did have an immediate impact within its time simply by helping to popularize anthropology, even if it wasn't really embraced by professional anthropologists for very long. And perhaps more importantly, it inspired generations of not anthropologists per se, but artists and poets and writers like I said, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, but also James Joyce, W.B. Yeats, and Robert Graves all wove its themes into some of their works. Even psychoanalysts like Freud and Jung drew from its pages, and it shows up in films and rock lyrics. It's in the lair of Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. Ultimately, the Golden Bough is both a product of its time, but it's also a perennial cultural artifact. I mean, that's why it is something that interested me, as I'd hear it referenced. And so even though Frazer's theories may no longer define modern anthropology, but his attempt to understand the psychological and spiritual commonalities of humanity remains very relevant. It reminds us that rituals and myths and taboos are more than just curiosities. They are clues to how people in every age have tried to make sense of the world around them. Even if his conclusions may not be as impactful as he was hoping they would be, the fact that he worked towards them has had a profound impact. I think it's always fascinating to engage with massive foundational texts, the kind that really help to create or revolutionize or at least popularize entire fields of study. And of course, the Golden Bough, it does that. It's maybe similar to something like Freud's work, where it sits at this peculiar space where its specific claims may not have stood the test of time, but its impact is undeniable. And so I felt as I was reading through this, you feel like you're stepping into the mind of someone who is utterly consumed by a project and someone who sifted through vast amounts of myth and ritual and ethnographic reports to uncover a grand, if flawed, theory of human belief. At times, the book feels like an intellectual odyssey, and even if you find yourself disagreeing with his conclusions or simply asking, where's he getting this from? I've never heard of this. You still can't help but admire the sheer scope of what he attempted. The 12+ volume is probably more than most of us can or should tackle, but even the abridged version, you get a sense of the ambition and intellectual curiosity that fueled the project. And what really stuck with me was its readability. I think that the author was writing for a literate but non-specialist audience, and that accessibility is key to understanding why this book became so influential. Even when his ideas overreach, his prose pulls you along, and that's part of its enduring legacy. Not just what it said, but how it invited so many people, including scholars and writers and artists, even the curious lay reader, into the study of myth and ritual. It may not be scientifically rigorous by today's standards, but it opened the door in a way that I did appreciate and did enjoy, although I don't know if I'm going to reread it anytime soon, but that's because over 1,500 pages of a book is asking a lot from anyone. So who is this for? Well, it is for readers who are curious about the deep roots of religion as well as myth and ritual, especially those who enjoy tracing patterns across cultures and asking big foundational questions. And I don't just mean that for what he is writing, but also to see the evolution of thinking about this. So if you've ever been fascinated by the idea that disparate traditions might spring from shared human impulses, so if you're drawn to works like Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, then this book will probably feel like a similar touchstone that you may find interesting. It's also a great read for literature lovers, especially those interested in modernism. So again, knowing that figures like T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, knowing that they drew inspiration from this, I think adds a layer to the reading experience, especially when you begin to recognize his fingerprints in their work, or you're aware of the fact of song lyrics or other famous works of fiction that carry elements of this in them. I think academically inclined readers, especially in fields like anthropology or religious studies or classical literature and maybe comparative mythology, will find this an interesting historic artifact. So again, it's not necessarily correct by modern standards, but it reveals how scholars once tried to systematize belief and culture. And it also rewards, I think, patient, close reading with moments of some insight. I'm not saying there's no insight ever. I just think that there are issues with how broad of a stroke he paints with the brush sometimes, and also a lot of questions about his sources. I think all of those are some of the biggest issues that are going to make this a challenge for people to enjoy it in quite the same way that they did when it was first published. But I think that if you take a step back, you can still appreciate it. So who is this not for? Well, I mean, it's not for readers expecting up-to-date anthropology or any kind of rigorous source citation or, I don't know, a modern sensibility about cultural context. The author's sweeping comparisons and speculative logic reflect a distinctly Victorian mindset, obviously often Eurocentric, sometimes a bit condescending, and occasionally deeply flawed in both method and interpretation, and much of it is just unsubstantiated. So if you're hoping for a careful, peer-reviewed ethnographic study, this will likely frustrate you. It's also not for those who struggle with dense or florid prose. Even though Frazer is a more engaging writer than many of his academic successors, the book still demands some stamina. I mean, the sheer length, the 69 chapters, even in the abridged edition, and the encyclopedic dive into mythologies and festivals and rituals can feel repetitive or meandering, especially without a strong background in classical literature or comparative religion to really help anchor the reader. And finally, I'd say if you're uncomfortable with seeing sacred stories, including Christian ones, placed alongside what he calls primitive myths, this may not be a comfortable read. Even though the author tried to avoid overt disrespect, his comparative approach still reads as reductive to many modern readers. And so if you're looking for a respectful theological treatment of religious belief, this is not it. This book, The Golden Bough, is a fascinating relic of intellectual history, both a flawed product of its time and a milestone in the comparative study of religion and myth and ritual. Reading it today is less about agreeing with his conclusions and more about understanding how certain academic and literary traditions came to be. Again, like I said, it's like reading Freud. You don't turn to it for the most accurate science anymore, but for the lasting impact and the provocative framework that shaped generations of thinkers. And yes, much of what he proposed has been challenged and outright rejected, but the ambition as well as the breadth and the vividness of his work continue to influence literature as well as cultural studies and religious scholarship. It's a book that doesn't just try to explain myths, it tries to tie all myths together in a single human narrative. Whether or not it succeeds is less important than the fact that it tried. So if you're up for the challenge and willing to wade through speculation and repetition and a hefty dose of colonial era bias, you just might find it a rewarding, even an interesting read. If you have read The Golden Bough, or if you've encountered it in literature or pop culture, maybe even in something like The Wasteland or Apocalypse Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please let me know in the comments what you're thinking. And again, I would like to remind you guys that I am making this video in at least partially in connection, maybe not this one quite as much, but in connection with my other channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan, where at least one of the videos I am looking at the origins of religion, and this was somewhat related to that. Like I said, this was also something that I just kept hearing referenced by professors and other people, and I said I'd finally read this. If that channel sounds interesting, please go check that out. Of course, check out any of my other reviews. I have a wide variety. I do not cover just historically significant books. I cover everything from sprawling fantasy to, of course, massive volumes of historical significance like the story of civilization. Please check any of those out. And if you're enjoying this video or any of my videos, please feel free to share them. The more people that know about my videos, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. And until next time, keep those pages turning.